Welcome to another Founder Wisdom podcast. We have Anthony Berryhill with us today. He's the owner and founder at Elite College Hacker. We're going to talk about his business today, his background. So, originally from New Orleans, and yeah, think of the most dangerous neighborhoods back in the days after Katrina. So that's been an important period of his life, and going to talk about that.
Yep.
He got upped from an outreach program and moved to college prep school, then Stanford and Yale, then teaching part time at Harvard Extension School. So that's quite a big change there. Podpire is presenting that one, podpire.com. It's my podcasting agency. If you want to start and monetize a podcast, you can go to podpire.com. We help you get paid with AdSense, with lead gen, and with sponsors. We have a free book teaching you how to do that. And welcome to the podcast. Tell me a bit more about yourself and what you're up to nowadays.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much for having me. So, per the introduction, my whole life has been about people development and strategy. So that began with my own background living in, one of the most you know, challenging New Orleans inner city schools, 100% racially segregated. And what I had to learn pretty quickly was I couldn't just do the normal thing that's expected out of me, right? Like, I'm short kid, overweight. I'm not going to be in sports. I have no musical ability, no rap, none of that. So I had to figure out how to hack, the educational system. There was an outreach program called, Summer Bridge, which is now the Breakthrough Collaborative. They work with students like in my background, and they helped me go to a school called Isidore Newman High School, where the Manning brothers in the NFL went. One of the most rigorous schools, and that I think that started my whole career in business because I had to very quickly learn how to speed read, how to analyze, tests. I had to think about ways in which we can do those things that aren't just taught to you, and that also echoed what I did a lot as part of my background as a competitive national circuit debater, where I had to, because frankly, I don't look like the person who would be the national champion. So I had to figure out how to understand how to ask questions, how to convince people who are from different backgrounds to vote for me over someone who comes from $1 million school. So that's when I went to Stanford, and I did a lot of the same work. I was a debate coach to pay my way through, and I was also doing a lot of work trying to kind of hack the educational system, trying to help Stanford in some cases teach writing more, better for undergraduates. And then when I went to Yale for a PhD, I did a lot of the same work in terms of organizational transformation, et cetera. So a lot of my work has been in those two realms. In the corporate realm, I've started from the basics of sales and client service, and then eventually was asked to start creating global learning and development programs, leveraging a lot of what I've already talked about. Like, how do we actually make education accessible? Like, for example, when you're trying to teach computer science, how do we do that properly and not just tell them to go on Google? And then the other half, and what I do full time now as well, is in terms of college admissions. So I work with students, about 60% from China, but I work with students who are often from very tough backgrounds. I help them kind of hack the admissions process ethically. And I guess we can talk about that. So those are my two businesses. Is one is on the corporate side, leveraging my past experience as a vice president of program management and learning, usually on the finance side, but also as a college admissions coach, where I work directly with people who are trying to do what I did, but they're coming from, more privileged backgrounds usually.
Fascinating. First, how does one survive post Katrina New Orleans? Describe the situation there and how you personally made it.
Yeah, yeah. I guess one qualify. I mean, I was there before, so Katrina hit about 5 to 7 years after I left high school. So I would even argue post Katrina New Orleans was actually easier than pre Katrina New Orleans, where I lived,
Okay.
because it was super segregated. There's a term, school to prison pipeline, that was very much accurate. Like, the schools I
Wow.
went to were prisons, and there was a lot of abuse and a lot of all kinds of craziness that could be its own book. And I think one of the ways I learned to survive that was to really think through, okay, I can either follow what I'm being told in my culture, in my family, what have you, or if I'm thinking I need to get out of poverty, right, and I don't want to have them be a stereotype, or, I have to do things differently, which is a whole, I'm sure I'll come back to that theme. So one of the things I did, which I help my students do, is I did my own research. Before we had Google, was Googling how to get into college, right? What does the college process look like? Because although my high school did amazing work, in general, I didn't have the kind of networks to tell me how to answer these essays. Another part was being a debater. So I mean, I learned the hard knocks of how to write and answer questions and be concise. So those things together has made me the professional I am now, not just in terms of going through school, but also helping others who are often stuck, right? They can't just rely on what their high schools tell them, like write a passion project. You can't write that to Stanford and think you're going to get in because they hear that all the time. You have to be a bit more nuanced and do more unusual things to get through. So it's those combinations of unusual experiences and being fearless about having them, along with being very intentional about how you communicate, how you train yourself, and building those skills, even if the systems or the cultures around you don't give them to you.
Right. And how did you survive the bullying? And did you like just stay at home, focus on your own stuff, and
Hmm.
not interact too much
Yeah,
socially? And eventually, one day, the admission letter came. Was and tell us about how game changing that moment was.
yeah, that's a great question. It was very much keeping it to myself, right? Because in those kind of inner city environments, a lot of the things that are normal to you are often pretty deleterious, right? So anyone who does urban education work or works in these places, they already understand this, right? They have to reculture the person to say, hey, it's okay not to spend all your time, dating people, or it's okay not to go to a gang, it's okay not to get into hip hop culture. You can be whoever you want to be, particularly when you try to go to somewhere else. And in terms of the admissions process, it was a tough one because on one hand, I have a story that's very unusual, right? How do I explain being essentially this person that my neighbor has never seen before? You know, an example I said in my college application essay was when I was flying to national debate tournaments every weekend, in the schools where I was the only person in the debate pool out of 300 students competing, and certainly the only one in the elimination rounds getting an award, which was shocking to people in the late 1990s. So the way I kind of framed it was, what is the authentic story? No BS, no buzzwords. And that story was, I don't feel like I belong anywhere. I feel like an alien. So I go to a fancy school where everyone's like, yeah, we don't have people from your background usually. And then I go back home, where everyone's like, you look like an alien because you sound weird, right? Like, why aren't you playing? Like, my parents were always told, he must be playing football, right? And then when they said, no, 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 this is an academic scholarship, he was tested, people just couldn't understand it. So my college application essay was called Saving Private Burial. It's somewhere on the internet. It was very much articulating 3 or 4 stories saying, hey, this is who I am. Take it or leave it. Story, 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 story. I'm trying to get out of here. Help me out. That was essentially the vibe of the essay. And from what my college counselor told me, it hit pretty hard. There were multiple schools that called him saying, hey, is this real? How's this person still standing or sane? Um, and then obviously those schools that called, I got in pretty quickly.
How did you optimize your brain for all these years? Is it just practice? Any memory tips? Any
Mhm.
speed reading tips
Yeah.
for us?
Sure. I call it, we spend so much time culturally in school talking about being athletically in shape, but we never talk about academically. Even the best schools in the world, right? They always say we're trying to assess who the best of the best students. I get triggered when I hear that kind of language. It's things you can teach. So one thing was speed reading. So when I went to learning in high school, the workload went from, oh, you're reading a chapter to you're going to be reading 200 pages of really hard philosophy or literature. So I went to Amazon, got a speed reading book, and did it on my own. I also did. I know there's like there are memory experts who've written books. So I got one of those books and practiced. And what I noticed is that it helped me kind of catch up to speed because I went from the public school system where you get an A for, in some cases, just doing your homework and not misbehaving, to a school that's just like the intellectual Marines, right? Where it's just like, oh no, we're gonna ask you the double stirred questions and the math problems, and that's your average question on the test. So a lot of those things, and I think in the debate side, I did a lot of self drilling, right? I would take a random article, a random argument, and say, I need to train myself to dissect whatever I hear and become a machine at doing it because I can't rely on reputation or appearances, etc. And a lot of my students, be it in the admission side, but also when I was on the corporate side, when I spent 10 years coaching people directly and sometimes executives on how to deal with difficult conversations or verbal judo, I teach them a lot of those same skills. And when I teach admissions people, we do interview drills. Like most recently, I had a student who was going for an MBA, and I put her through debate drills, question after question, dissecting the structure, dissecting how they're saying, and she ended up getting a full ride to Duke's free core program. So there's been a happy combination of all of those things.
Does a life change when you're admitted to one of these Ivy League schools? Does this badge of honor still have value in today's market?
Good question. It's very much a what do you make out of it. I think a lot of the marketing is if you just go to these schools, your life will be perfect. When I'm doing an intake call, and if I hear a language like I just need to get an Ivy, I get very scared for lots of reasons. But the two big ones: one, that tells me they don't know what they want, which really bites you in the butt when you're trying to answer questions that are probing you, right? Because Harvard doesn't want to just hear, "Oh, I just want an Ivy." They do not want to hear that. Just as in business, right? We don't want to hear, "Oh, you're going to work at Goldman Sachs because of the money," right? So, I think in terms of the value, what I always tell people, be it on the corporate side or the admission side, is you have to have a very clear intention about what you're looking for and assess the opportunity accordingly. So we think about this in terms of jobs, and we don't think about this in terms of educational opportunities. So, for example, although I went to Stanford for undergrad, I do tell some students, don't go to Stanford if you're looking for being a political philosopher. It's not, we read the core curricula. I make them go through those details to make sure they're making informed decisions, which also helps them get in. I think overall, if you're looking for a quick way to a high check, no institution is going to do that. No institution can. But what's great about Ivies or Ivy Plus schools, as we call them, is that they have a lot of resources that if you're intentional about what you're trying to do, they can give them to you. You can meet people. That's what I think the value is. I think the problem is a lot of people look at these institutions and their high price tag saying, I'm a great student. I'm just going to walk in and I'm going to get a computer science job and work at Meta. No, seriously, I hear that 10 times a year. People write that in essays and I stop them. It's more like you go to a Harvard, Stanford, whatever, because you want to meet the kind of people who are just as driven as you are, and that you can find the kind of professors or the people who are on the cutting edge of that work, and then you use them to accelerate your progress. Whereas a lot of people are more passive and they're just thinking they're going to buy a job. Those institutions are not designed for that.
What is wrong about our education system? Do you feel that we should
Mhm.
teach meditation at school?
Yeah.
Do you feel we should give a shot to other people, adapt to their learning styles, have more teachers to per student? For example, I use ChatGPT to learn a lot
Right.
nowadays. It has supercharged my learning, just like you. I'm a super
Mhm.
nerd when it comes to learning. Should AI be allowed at school?
Yeah. Let me take one of those parts. So I think the biggest problem I see in every educational context, and I'm going to include the corporate work I've done as a consultant or as a VP or whatever, no one teaches you how to learn. And I think that's the biggest problem. So often educational institutions are they're so focused on kind of normalizing people and rank ordering them, best students, smartest person, what have you. But as we all know in the business world, none of that nonsense matters, right? It's more about, can you articulate your value proposition? Can you communicate well? Are you a jerk at work? Right? Can you negotiate? Can you do the core fundamentals? And those things are not taught in school. Sometimes deliberately, because professors and academics are not good at that stuff. But other times because what's the goal of a university? The goal is to create research and grants and create knowledge, not to make an individual employable or personally healthy. And I think people aren't aligned on that. So should we teach meditation in schools? I think it should be an option, right? But I think if I were to wave my magic wand, I would say those schools should be better, more inclusively designed. And I don't mean DEI, because I don't think that DEI is inclusion. But I mean, like, we should think about curricula and systems from the perspective of people who are walking in with no resources. Like myself, when I went to Stanford, I had $100, but no one called me to say, "Hey, you need a car," or no one said, "You need to go to office hours," or, "Hey, what the professor saying in lecture is going to be nowhere near as it's going to be much easier than what's on the test." So I think if those schools are starting to do this with like low income first generation programs, but there's a lot more work to be done both on the university side and on the corporate side to make sure we're not just throwing people in these systems and just thinking they'll survive on their own, which is what 90% of these learning institutions, corporate or admissions, do.
What about teaching entrepreneurship? I'm starting CEOuni.com, which will
Yeah.
teach youngsters how to be CEOs and founders at a very young age and be profitable by
Mhm.
seven. Do you think that would make sense? Do you think that concept would scale?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it reminds me of what, when I was working in the expert network and finance industries. It's, this notion of entrepreneurship, right? It's teaching people to think as if they are a business and to take that kind of ownership. So certainly programs like that are, I think, exactly where we need to go. Now, whether or not it has to be in the business realm is a different conversation, because I think there are business, as we see in MBA programs, right? There's a, even in the business world, there are people who are trying to do social enterprisey, like activism stuff. They need the same skills as well as what you're teaching. Right? They need to be able to scope projects. They need to be able to actually do good group work, right? They actually need to be able to be a project manager. So absolutely, I support a lot of those programs.
What about debating? Debating, I think, could potentially be a top 10 skill in my
Hmm.
world. If
Sure.
interviewing people is one, right? Asking the
Hmm.
right questions and
Yeah.
meditation and thinking. Debating, I think it's quite amazing, but very few people know how to do it. A lot of people
Hmm.
nowadays they get emotional, right, when you
Hmm.
go against what they stand for. So, how should one debate, and why could it be a potentially life-changing skill?
Yeah, I'm actually working on a book on this about how to teach debate skills to people who didn't go to high schools that have it, or people who did debate but didn't really learn the core fundamentals. The way I learned when I was competing and when I have coached kids to win national championships in debate, the first thing I teach people about debating is most of it's listening and not doing what we see on news shows, like over talking people or gaslighting what they, misrepresenting what they say. That actually, at least in competitive debates, like the National Speaking Debate Organization, their championships, that stuff at the highest levels gets you absolutely killed, because the judges are smart to say, hey, that's not what they said, or you missed this argument. Right. So number one is listening and being very authentic in your listening. Like I always teach people, listen to what is said, not what you want them to say, i.e., take your opponent at their highest level. Because what often people will do is they'll try to mutate the argument and ignore nuance, kind of like dirty political debates we see here. But when you're dealing with a very skilled person, that's not going to fly. So, for example, I was working at Gerson Limmer Group, like the number one expert network firm. And when I had to recruit CEOs, I couldn't BS them. In fact, they would say, hey, Anthony, don't BS me. They would actually use those words, because it's a debate, right? They would say, why should I do this? Or I'm not going to do this. The best way to win that debate is to recognize where you agree and leverage those agreements. That's one thing. And I would also say, do more reading. Even in national circuit debate, what's happened is that people are using ChatGPT. They're getting, debate files and evidence from high school, sorry, college people. They're trying to find shortcuts to everything. But the problem is, what happens when you're against someone who's trying to win a championship? Right? They're going to know you did that and have files and things ready for you. Right. So the highest stakes things you can't really BS your way through. You are expected to know what you mean. And that means reading the books, reading the articles. For example, I talked about DEI. The biggest problem with DEI is not diversity, equity, inclusion, is that I can say from the HR perspective, as someone who's published on these things, often the people who are studying and haven't read critical race theory, they haven't read Bell Hooks' work and see the distinctions or use the proper language in the proper way, which means that those programs end up failing to convince someone whether or not to cut your department or not. That's just one
I
example for me.
I like that. Let's talk about the DEI thing. We're
Hmm.
seeing that President Trump is cutting out on that,
Hmm.
for better and for worse. Elon is supporting this. What's your
Yeah,
actual take on that? Because I feel we should give people a shot. I believe there's also something toxic when you disrupt competition and when you help
yeah.
someone too much, right? And they get
Hmm.
addicted on that help. But I feel that's only 5% of cases, right? How many
Hmm.
immigrant stories have we got in the US in which the
Yeah.
government has helped them? And now that these are top founders, top CEOs in the country, helping create millions of jobs, right? So, what's your take on what's happening right now?
I think there's a, this is kind of harking on a lot of what I wrote in my dissertation back in the day at Yale. There's a distinction between symbolic politics and kind of the model that we're actually doing. So we look at DEI, like diversity, equity, inclusion are great things. But the way that it's been manifested is more in terms of symbolic politics of, okay, we're going to throw this event for black tech professionals. No examples, their conferences, right? But we're not going to do the work to make sure those people, when they send in the LinkedIn, are guaranteed interviews, right? We're not answering the questions. We're just saying, I mean, I've been that person. I've been in Austin. We have lots of these. I've gone to hundreds of these things. And what I've never seen is, okay, have a non-traditional background. I'm in the DEI office. I'm going to make sure you're connected to the right person. There's a lot of that kind of internal work that has to be done to deal with the structural issues they're talking about, because most of those things in practice end up being, okay, we have a big budget, we're doing cultural events. Then you have a gap between, okay, what happens to the person from the projects who have these 4 degrees but doesn't have the resources? Like, in other words, the story's correct, right? But if you want to actually do the work, you have to do things that are not as sexy, right? You have to do kind of the negotiation, the debating with people, the writing out of strategy plans, where you're bringing in agile development, the stuff I've done for 10 years, and I know others are doing. So I think the quote unquote DEI, like a lot of that getting wiped out, doesn't really, it hasn't had a material effect on, do I make sure these people who are being discriminated against or ignored, are they getting in the seats, right? Are we making certain that their promotions are not? That work hasn't been done for good and bad reasons, not good and bad reasons, but for multiple reasons. So I believe in diversity, equity, inclusion. I think the biggest challenge I would say is, if we're going to be inclusive, we have to include people we don't agree with. We have to include the minorities who don't look a certain way to fit a certain narrative, right? And because that failure has happened, you're not seeing as much protection or kind of fight back, right, from the very communities that are being represented. So that's something I'm thinking deeply about. Like, for example, there's a word intersectionality. If you really listen to that word, right, what does it mean? It means we take people as they are and represent their experience. We don't just say it's a Black issue, it's a female issue, because that's the opposite what a lot of that literature that created DEI was meant to do.
Fully agree. It's always hard to me to forge an opinion on that one because I came from sort of a privileged background. But I will tell you that once I employed a bunch of employees, and um, diversity, quote unquote, was naturally being seen in my
Hmm.
team just because I looked at brains.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that is because I'm Canadian and so forth, but yeah, like I've never had that issues. I've always looked at IQ, for example, and if they're fit to do the task, if they're the best at doing that task. So I cannot really put myself in your shoes, for example, and see your struggle, right, of facing all these challenges and constantly being refused and dealing with that. How could people really feel that struggle? One,
Hmm.
and second, what would be the lowest hanging fruit that we could bring so that people actually have a shot without
Hmm.
disbalancing competition and so forth?
Yeah. I think ironically, college admissions has done a good job of this. Right, when they talk about holistic admission, like on the right, that's framed as, oh, it's DEI light. No, it's not. It's, if you think about a college, what are they? These kind of colleges, what do? Their entire business is, we need the best people in every single space. So they do targeted outreach to make sure students who come from, let's say, the public schools I used to come from, they actually know what Stanford is. Right? You can't have meritocracy if the information asymmetries exist because of things that you have no control. So I think that's where the Trumpers are completely wrong, right? You can just say merit all you want, but the people who have the most merit may not even know they have it, or they may not even have the people to tell them, hey, you have a 4.0, you can apply to Stanford. And I've worked with a lot of those students where they don't know they're good enough, even though they have all the perfect scores. So I think number one is sharing information, which is why I've been working so much. I'm not trying to write books and start the social media campaigns to say, hey, student, you may come from this background, but these are the skills you need to know. If we just did that, even on a small scale, that goes a long way. I'll give you an example. One of my major learning and development projects was working with, I mean, I'm not going to say names for obviously confidentiality reasons, but there were a lot of people of color who were failing the first interview of the video interview. And when I looked at it, and I did an audit of myself, and I just did it because I didn't want to ask permission, what I noticed is that they were expected to answer questions in 1 minute. Sometimes the questions were frankly inappropriate for 20 somethings. Like, name a time you led without authority. And I thought, wait a minute, I was doing a PhD in leadership. That was a whole That was a third of my reading list. How are these 21-year-olds going to answer that question?
Yeah.
There's your low-hanging fruit, right? It's making sure we're asking the question, is it reasonable for someone, like, let's just take your standard employee, right? Is it reasonable for them to have these expectations? What are the expectations? Is it reasonable to have those expectations? And are all these things in line? And in that case, what I did was I said, okay, fine. I'm going to tell you what the kinds of questions we expect you to know. And then we'll then grade you on how well you do it. We've already made things more equitable. We've already made more diverse by adding more information and taking things that are normally hidden because of race, class, gender, or whatever, and making them just straight out. Like, we're going to test you on this. Here's some places you can go. And now we can have a meritorious conversation. I think too often we want merit, but we want to kind of do a see no evil, hear no evil, right? When there are whole swaths of people who do agree with the kind of the meritorious model, but they're not even given the information to know what the game that they're playing is. So then what you're measuring is not merit. You're measuring, are my parents rich? Do they have someone on the inside who can tell, hey, you're applying to this wealth fund. Here's what this strategy is, and here are the questions I'll ask you.
Yeah, in my opinion, we need to also change the system from the top, right? Because these wealthy parents can just create a little robot that's good at answering questions, especially with AI coming up, I think that's totally going to change the game. And the electoral system should change as well, but we're going to keep that one for another pod. Where can people find out more about you, Ant?
Yes, yes. So so I'm on LinkedIn. It's Anthony Berryhill, but I also have a website. So it's www.elitecollegehacker.com. That includes a lot of the work I'm doing on the admissions side. I'm starting to build out some more enterprise practice as well. But if you go to those websites, and also my email, I'm Anthony@elitecollegehacker.com. LinkedIn, email, those are probably the best ways to get in touch with me. Whether be it someone wants to work on admission stuff, either individually or on a larger scale, like a guidance counselor or something, or on the corporate HR side, because a lot of what I'm doing is about organizational transformation and making sure we drive revenue, right? By actually having inclusion and having systems that help every employee, but particularly employees from the kind of backgrounds I come from.
That was Anthony Berryhill, and